We're having an election November 6th, the day 11 propositions.
I'm Pat Morrison in the Crawford Family Forum with a lot of good citizens all ready to find out how to cast their votes. That was a bit of the California Voter Foundation proposition song, cramming this time 10 proposition summaries in one referendum into one short song. We're going to be doing it in about an hour right here in the Crawford Family Forum, and we are live streaming for an hour and a half. You can check that out at kpcc.org. In the meantime, we're talking about the propositions this time on the ballot. There are famous propositions 98, 13, Prop 8 that have changed the very nature of California. It may happen again this time as we talk about the propositions that Californians will be voting on in November. It's not a debate, it's an information session. So get out your ballot pamphlets, 144 pages. You can follow along. There's also a handy quick reference guide in the front. The sound of shuffling paper you hear is the people here at the Crawford Family Forum looking up all these measures in their own ballots, which you can do at home. So welcome again, and please thank our guests. Bob Stern is the former president of the Center for Governmental Studies and the man who really sort of designed this ballot pamphlet, right?
Yes, that's right, 1973.
So you have him to thank for having it at your fingertips, and John Matsusaka is the president of USC's Initiative and Referendum Institute. He's professor of law in the Gould School of Law and of Business in the Marshall School of Business. Thank you both.
Thank you.
We've tried to group these according to some thematic unity here, and the first ones that seem to come up are the ones that deal with crime. Perhaps most controversially, Prop 34, which would end the death penalty in California. Californians restored the death penalty in 1978 after the Supreme Court vacated it, and in about 35 years, California has executed 13 people. The argument, well, that it doesn't work very well, and other people say it's simply time to stop it. So, Bob Stern, maybe you could take the lead on this one.
Thank you, Pat. We have 729 people still on death row. Most of them are still appealing. In addition to the people who have been executed, around a dozen or so, 84 have died prior to execution, and the 75 sentences have been reduced, although none have been commuted or pardoned. The proposition changes the death penalty to life without possibility of parole, and the savings, which are estimated at $100 to $130 million a year, will go to police departments, sheriff's departments, and so forth. The supporters include Gil Garcetti, who's the former DA of Los Angeles, who says he's still a death penalty proponent, but says we're just not executing people, so why have it? And that money can be used for better purposes. And some people in other states have been found innocent. He also says, let's return these prisoners who are being coddled now, these death penalty prisoners who have their own cells, their own TVs, and let's put them in with the general population.
Also, the former warden of San Quentin, who was responsible for death row, is a supporter of this measure. Who's opposing it?
Well, the opponents, and they include several of the DAs throughout the state, say that the death penalty serves as a deterrent. We need to speed up the appeals process, and some people deserve to be executed.
John Matsusaka, there are arguments on the other side, including those by Pete Wilson, the former governor of California, saying we need to stay with the death penalty.
Well, I think that there's a cost issue here which is involved, which is something like Bob says 130 million. I've seen estimates of about $70 million. In terms of the overall size of the California budget, it's not clear it's that much money, although we can certainly use the money for good things. But I think there's also the moral or ethical argument which is out there, and it could cut either way. Some people think it's simply immoral or unethical to be executing people, and we don't want to live in that kind of society. But others think it's a proper form of justice that we ought to have.
It's interesting that Gil Garcetti says, I'm not talking about the moral part of it. He said, I am for the death penalty. We're just not carrying out the sentences, so why have it? Why not save the money?
Do you think Californians who voted this in 1978 are looking for an opportunity to change, which this vote would do?
The polls show it's very, very close. Every vote's going to count. The polls show it slightly behind, which probably means it's going to go down. 2 states have repealed the death penalty already, Connecticut and Illinois. It'll be interesting to see what the voters do this time.
There's also an economic argument about another crime-related measure on the ballot, Proposition 36, about changes in the 3 strikes law. Steve Cooley, the outgoing district attorney of Los Angeles, tried to change that a while ago. He's now on board with changing it under these circumstances. So, John Matsusaka, maybe you can explain the thinking behind this one.
Sure. The original three strikes law was adopted in 1994, and I think most people know what it is by now. If you commit three felonies, you go to jail for life. It's three strikes and you're out. Ever since it was passed, I think even the people who supported it have had some concerns whether it might be inequitable, because there are some people who on the third strike committed what seemed to be fairly innocuous crimes as far as it goes, but were still sentenced to life imprisonment. So the law was modified in 2000 that let certain drug-related nonviolent crimes not count. And this is a second attempt to try to make a more general blanket exemption for nonviolent for certain types of nonviolent third strikes. The last attempt of 2004 was polling very, very well. It was well ahead almost all the campaign. And then I think it was the last weekend, there was a media barrage in which Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was a governor at the time, and the four previous governors, Jerry Brown, George Deukmejian, Pete Wilson, and Gray Davis, all came out against the measure, and it turned the tide at the very last minute.
At this point, at least as I was checking, George Soros had put $1 million toward changing the three strikes law. Charlie Beck, the chief of police of LA, was supporting changing three strikes. It's still a money argument, Bob Stern. People are saying if you end the death penalty, if you change three strikes, you're saving California money.
You save the state about $70 million. And what I am surprised about is every newspaper, major newspaper, is for it, and no major interest group is against it except for the California Republican Party. And the polls show this one is way ahead, 72% yes. Now, if there's a campaign against it, as we know, if money is spent against a proposition, a lot of money spent against a proposition, it tends to be defeated, because when people are confused, they tend to vote no.
So every dollar spent against a proposition is probably more powerful than dollars spent for?
Much more powerful. You've had PG&E for a couple of years ago spending $50 million in support of a proposition, literally no money spent against it, and PG&E lost, as did Mercury Insurance a few years ago. We'll be getting to that other one as well. But if you spend money against a proposition, almost always, if it's enough money, you will defeat the proposition, even if a lot of money is being spent for it.
Let's move to Proposition 35, the ban on human trafficking and sex slavery. It sounds pretty easy, but what else is there to it, Mr. Matsusaka?
I thought Bob was taking the lead on this one.
Well,
I'm sorry.
All right. It increases prison sentences and fines for human trafficking convictions. It expands the definition of trafficking to include distributing obscene material depicting a child. It requires convicted human traffickers to register as sex offenders, requires registered sex offenders to disclose internet activities and identities. Mm-hmm. There's a multimillionaire pushing this named Chris Kelly.
Who ran for Attorney General a few years ago.
He did. This is supported by most major newspapers, with a few exceptions, such as the Los Angeles Times, the Sacramento Bee, and the San Francisco Bay Guardian, who say it's not well crafted. And the legislature has already responded with tough laws, but not surprisingly, about 80% of the public polled say they're going to support it. This one is probably going to pass overwhelmingly.
Mr. Matsusaka, what are the arguments against it?
I'm not sure that I'm not aware of any prominent arguments against it, but I think this is one of the really interesting types of issues that we see in initiative states, which is a quirky issue which one individual seems to be able to put on the ballot, really because he or she has the money to do it. There have been some accusations that this might be just a way for somebody to advance, for the sponsor to advance his career. That, of course, doesn't mean the law doesn't have merit in and of itself, but that's one of the negatives that I've heard.
Real quickly?
Yeah, one of the arguments was the legislature's already responded, already taken care of. You don't need to have this. This is not a well-written initiative.
And that's, of course, a subject that always comes up, not how people feel about it, but how well they're written. We're in the Crawford Family Forum going through your ballot, all the propositions, 10 of them, 10 initiatives, and 1 referendum on the ballot for your November ballot, so you can follow along, live streaming too at kpcc.org. And now we get to the big money ones, Proposition 30 and Proposition 38. Bob Stern, can you take the lead on Prop 30, which is Governor Brown's measure?
This is fairly straightforward. It increases high-income earners' income taxes for 7 years and everyone's sales tax by 0.25% for 4 years.
A quarter of a cent on the dollar.
Right, in order to fund schools and public safety. It's going to raise about $6 billion a year. If it doesn't pass, the legislature has already enacted a trigger cut measure, reducing school funding by $6 billion a year. This is competing with Prop 38. And under Supreme Court rulings, if both propositions pass, the other one, Prop 38, the one that gets the most votes prevails in its entirety. This one's supported by Jerry Brown.
Sounds like wrestling.
So this one's supported by Jerry Brown and is opposed by the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association and Charles Munger, who's the brother of Molly Munger, who's the proponent of Prop 38.
And together, this family has spent something like $50 million on this ballot go-round, is that right?
It's a very wealthy family.
So Proposition 30, what are the critics of Proposition 30 saying about it, Mr. Matsusaka?
Well, the critics of Proposition 30 are making a couple of arguments. There's the usual argument whether it's a good idea to be raising taxes in a time economic downturn. They're also raising questions about how much money actually goes to schools in this proposition. You've probably seen a lot of campaigns on that. I've actually dug into that a bit to try to understand that. I think that there's the truth is sort of somewhere in between these things. I think it's pretty clear that more money will go to schools this year, almost certainly if the measure passes, and probably in the future years. I think it's also true, though, that not all the money will go to schools, and so some of the money will go to other things that people don't like as much, potentially high-speed rail and so forth. So I think for the voters, I think it presents an interesting choice where if you vote yes, you're going to raise taxes, you're going to probably get more money to schools, but you may also end up funding things that you don't necessarily like.
So Bob Stern, one of the things it says, look, it's going to be audited, we're going to have public safety realignment, there's going to be funding for other programs, not just education in this budget.
Well, it's mainly for education. 89% goes to K through 12, 11% to community colleges. A person who spends $30,000 on a new car, for example, will pay $75 more. Or if you spend $30,000 on taxable items that don't include food or housing or services, you'd pay $75 more. But if you're a millionaire, as most of the audience is,
oh yes,
if you earn over $250,000, I think about half the audience says they earn over $250,000, you would pay 1 to 3% more in your income taxes. And that's one of the arguments. They said it will discourage people from living in California, millionaires, and we would lose half our audience.
Does this require a 2/3 vote?
Now, no state proposition requires a 2/3 vote. All state
Not even taxing propositions?
All state propositions are 51%. And the legislature, if they wanted to pass this tax, it would take a 2/3 vote.
Is that why it's on the ballot?
Well, the legislature was given the opportunity to pass it. Not one Republican supported it.
Yeah, I just want to clarify one thing about the 89% number, which is exactly right in the sense that the money goes into a special fund of which 89% goes to schools. But the important thing to remember is there's no guarantee that the legislature can't cut education funding from other sources to offset the money actually in this budget, actually in the fund. And that's why it becomes unclear exactly what's going to be done with the money, except we know that at least 40% is going to be locked in for education.
And of course, that's one of the criticisms about Prop 30. We'll get to Prop 38 too when we come back. We are at the Crawford Family Forum, live streaming and with a live audience going through your ballot for the November election.
I'm Tammy Trujillo. A new analysis
I'm Pat Morrison. Get out your ballot pamphlet because we're helping you do your homework for voting in November on the ballot initiatives and the one referendum on the California state ballot. 10 of them, one referendum. And of course, it's California voters who so often determine the course of the state with these votes. Right now, we're talking with our guests, Bob Stern and John Matsusaka, about Props 30 and 38. Prop 30, the one put on the ballot by Jerry Brown. Of course, the governor is supporting it. So is the California Teachers Association, the Democratic Party, the Federation of Teachers, all because much of the money is meant to go to education, both K through 12 and community colleges. Bob Stern, is this a make or break for the California budget? Is that why the governor put this on here?
Well, that's right. Jerry Brown thought the economy would come back stronger. It didn't. He's going to see a big cut in schools if this doesn't pass. And the question I have is, if this goes down, does Jerry Brown run for re-election? After all, he was the youngest governor we ever elected. He was the oldest governor we ever elected. And the question is, will his heart be in it if this doesn't pass?
And John Matsusaka, we're going to be getting to Prop 38, which is viewed as a competitor for this, because this is both of these are about raising money for education. And any last words about 30 before we move on to 38 and kind of set our battle scene here?
No, let's go to 38.
Let's go to 38. All right, you said the words. Go ahead.
So Prop 38 is sponsored by Molly Munger, who's an education activist. As we already mentioned, her brother is sort of on the negative side of these campaigns. What this proposition does is it raises income taxes more or less across the board. Lower income people have smaller increases than wealthy people, but it's going all the way down to people making $7,316. So it's an across-the-board income tax increase for 12 years. The money would go to education. This measure actually is written much more tightly in the sense that I feel relatively confident to say most of the money will go to education. There's some pretty clear language which seems like it would prevent the legislature from substituting money that's raised here by cutting money in other parts of the budget. The downside of this, or the arguments that have been made against it are first of all, it's not clear, again, whether you want to raise taxes in the middle of a recession. There's also the question whether the tax increases are bringing greater progressivity into the California tax code. And we already have a highly progressive income tax code in California, and in some ways, many...
that means the more money you make, the more you pay in taxes.
It means your fraction goes up. So it's not even... wealthy people pay more, but increasingly more. The challenge that's caused for California in the last 25 years or so is that our entire revenue system is highly volatile. When there's good times, the rich make a lot of money and the state has a ton of money. In bad times, the bottom falls out, and we found ourselves having a very difficult time trying to manage that. So that's one of the downsides that concerns people that think about budgeting.
You know, Pat, 1% of the taxpayers pay 40% of the personal income tax.
That's why everybody was watching that Facebook IPO so closely.
I mean, 1% of our taxpayers pay $50 billion in income tax. It's amazing.
What does a 0.4% increase in income tax, which Prop 38 would provide for the lowest level earner, people earning over $7,316 a year, how much does that work out? You said Jerry Brown's would be $75 on a new car. What does Prop 38 mean in real numbers?
Is that $40 a thousand? It's $40.
Sounds
So
right.
if you earn $1,000, I think it's $40. Is that right?
Sounds right.
Something like that.
And the people who are supporting this, of course, Molly Munger, as you heard, who's put a lot of millions of her own money toward this. There are other teachers organizations, some education groups, but the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are opposing this. Why is that?
Well, I think the Democratic Party is opposing it because Jerry Brown is opposing it. They want Prop 30. They're worried that with two propositions on the ballot, both are going to go down. The Republican Party is opposing it because they're opposing taxes. They're opposing Prop 30 as well. All the newspapers, except for the Bakersfield Californian and the very liberal San Francisco Bay Guardian, are opposing it. Now, I'm not quite sure the Bakersfield Californian
That's quite a combination.
is supporting it, but they are. And I understand why the Bay Guardian is opposing it.
And what is the track record of measures like this when they go to the voters?
Yeah, you know, in the last 10 years, I think we've only passed one tax increase, and that was the millionaire's tax increase for mental health. Every other tax measure has gone down, including just in June, the cigarette tax that only applied to 15% of the people. So the voters are very, very reluctant to increase taxes. And the Brown measure shows right now a poll at about 50%. Which means with all these ads being run against it, there's a good chance it's going to go down.
Where is the money coming from, and where is the money going on Props 30 and 38?
Well, the interesting thing is, of course, the money on Prop 38 is coming from Molly Munger, and I haven't seen any money really being spent against it. I think that they're basically, most people think it's going to go down. On Prop 30, the labor unions are supporting it, but because of another proposition, Prop 32, which we'll get to, the labor unions are focusing their money on defeating Prop 32, and so Jerry Brown is scrambling to raise enough money on Prop 30. On the no side, business groups are opposing it, as is Charles Munger, who's putting in a lot of money against it.
And why would there not be money, Mr. Matsusaka, going into 30 the way that you might expect to see, the opposition to 30? Because there's an awful lot of support money going for it.
Well, there is some money going into. I was looking. I've got $18 million coming in from the Small Business Action Committee, but it's not as much as you might expect. I think that many of the major corporations are concerned about the state of education in the state, because clearly an uneducated workforce doesn't do them any good. And I think they're reasonably happy with this sort of thing because of the taxes. Again, the taxes are not necessarily going to make a huge impact on them.
We're talking about Propositions 30 and 38, the two tax measures on the California November ballot. The one, sponsored by Governor Jerry Brown, is called the Schools and Local Public Safety Protection Act. Proposition 38, sponsored by Attorney Molly Munger, is called the Local Schools and Early Education Investment and Bond Debt Reduction Act. Of course, a lot of people, Bob Stern, only look at the titles of these and decide accordingly, but that's like saying the apple pie and mom amendment sometimes.
Well, that's right. They do look at the titles when they go into the ballot box, but on these, they're seeing enough ads for both for and against 30 and then for 38 that they have a general idea, I think. And these 30-second ads are very effective, as are slate mailers. And when you get a slate mailer, by the way, take a look at whether there's an asterisk next to the proposition of the candidate. If there is, it means they paid to be on that slate mailer. It doesn't necessarily mean the organization is just doing it out of generosity or deciding that they like it. Slate mailers are paid for by the people who have the asterisks next to it.
This is sometimes why you see a picture of someone like Ronald Reagan or Howard Jarvis at the top of a slate mailer, but Democrats then farther down,
yes,
right?
That's right.
One thing we also know is that when voters make decisions, they rely a lot on endorsements or what are called information cues. They're looking for what an interest group that they're affiliated with, like an environmental group or a newspaper that they trust its judgment. But we find that voters pay a lot of attention to endorsements from people that they trust, and that's actually how they find their way to their answers in many cases.
And go to a website called CaliforniaChoices.org. It lists all the newspapers' endorsements, yes or no. It lists all the organizations, yes or no. So CaliforniaChoices.org. California Choice is one word.
California Choice, singular?
Yes.
CaliforniaChoice.org. We're talking about ballot measures 30 and 38, which are the big ballot measures duking it out on the November ballot for California voters. The backdrop to this, of course, is Prop 98, which set formulas for spending on schools that now, according to some educators, it's turned out to be inadequate. And this is why Jerry Brown and Molly Munger both say that their measures are going to do the best for schools. Mr. Matsusaka, you want to speak to that?
Well, Prop 98 is a measure that the voters approved in 1988, which basically said the state has to spend about 40% of its revenue on schools. And so that locked in a certain amount of money. Of course, when the overall revenue plunges, then the amount of money that goes to school isn't committed anymore. So part of these measures are an attempt to make up for that shortfall.
And school budgets have been cut $20 billion since 2008.
We're talking about the propositions. We're here in the Crawford Family Forum with a live audience that may have questions about these. If you want to raise your hand, one of our producers will come around to you. And we have a question over here. Can you tell us who you are and where you're from?
My name's David from South Pasadena. I'd like to know what the economic impact is on schools statewide and also the possible social economic impact over the next decade. Has anyone ever made an estimate on that?
Of these two measures, you mean?
Yes, on the 30 and 38.
So how much funding are we talking about going to schools with these? And of course, it's got to be spread around a pretty big state.
Well, it's $10 billion on the Molly Munger one through K through 12 and early childhood education, and also paying off the state debt. It's $6 billion, at least for the first year, in terms of the schools on Prop 30, and then after that, it's up to the legislature. So this is pretty big money, actually, we're talking about in both of these propositions.
Right. I mean, the challenge with those estimates, I think the short answer is I'm not at least aware of anybody that's actually done those studies. The short answer is if you take the money through the tax system and put it into schools, you are going to get something for that, but then you're also going to lose whatever it was going to be spent at before. That money is not in the hands of consumers or businesses to be invested or spent. So there's a trade-off there, and I haven't really seen any estimates of exactly how that shakes out.
We're talking about Propositions 30 and 38. Let's see if we can get another audience question here. Thank you. Who are you and where are you from?
I'm David McCabe. I'm the professor at Pasadena City College's Teacher Preparation Program.
And your question?
And I do have a question. What would you recommend to people who want to vote in favor of funding education? I've heard arguments that if you're not sure and you want to make sure schools get funded, vote for both.
Yeah, if you vote for both and both pass, it depends on how many of you voted for one of them. Whichever gets the most votes prevails in its entirety. So you clearly can vote for both. So it is
winner take all.
It is winner take all under the Supreme Court ruling.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think if you had your choice and you just want as much money going into education as possible, the Munger measure probably makes more sense.
On the other hand, the Munger measure is not polling as well. So if you want something to pass, you probably should vote for both.
So we have one more question on Props 30 and 38 here.
Well, I'm a little confused on the school funding. How do you keep track of what's going to happen, and how do you even out the good years from the bad years, and how does this combine with the money from gambling or that goes in?
Oh, the lottery money is pretty negligible, as I remember. But
what happened with the lottery money? What happened with the lottery money is they actually reduced some of the education money because of the lottery. But yeah, I mean, John is right. It really is going to depend on how well the economy does. That's how well the schools do. If the economy is tanking, as it has been doing the last few years, school funding goes down.
There's no provision for building a pile of smoothing out the ups and downs.
That was a question about whether there's an evening out mechanism. And I'm sorry, we can't take follow-ups if you're not on the mic, but if you want to address this one.
The answer is no.
Okay, we have one more question on this, please.
My name is Matthew Atha. I'm from Pasadena, and my question is, what is the difference on impact to higher education between these two measures?
Well, the Prop 30 does affect higher education. Prop 38 does not. Prop 38 is only K through 12 and only early childhood education, whereas Prop 30 deals with community colleges. And Brown has said if Prop 30 passes, we won't have a tuition increase for University of California. Not whether he's right or not, I'm not sure, but clearly if Prop 30 goes down, you will be seeing tuition increases for the public universities. John's university it doesn't affect because his is a private university.
There's so many tens of millions of dollars going into this. The California Teachers Association, Service Employees International on Prop 30, and among others, of course, Molly Munger on Prop 38. How much money, Mr. Matsusaka, does the money usually end up translating into dollars? We heard earlier that no money tends to be more powerful than yes money.
Well, I agree with Bob on that. I think the way it works is that voters need to be convinced to vote yes. So this is not in every case, but in most cases, if you can raise a doubt in the voter's mind, they'll typically be fairly conservative and say, you know what, I don't know, I'm going to vote no. And so the no case has an inherently easier path to follow because they just have to raise sufficient doubts to make people nervous. And I think that's true in this case as well.
Let's move on to one of the more curious measures on the ballot. It's the only referendum. A referendum comes from the legislature, not from petitions and signatures that are circulated. And it's the one that Bob Stern, I'm kind of curious because the people who were for it, or who were, the people who were against it said, no, we're not against it anymore.
Well, this referendum is actually, it was circulated as a ballot measure, challenging the redistricting commission's plan for the state senate only.
So you remember you voted for the state redistricting commission, right? It did its work, it redrew the Senate lines, and now who was saying we don't like this anymore?
The Republicans who sponsored the redistricting commission got very upset after they came out with their lines and said,
"Be careful what you wish for; might come true."
And the state, they only referended the state senate races, but after they circulated the petitions and qualified it for the ballot, the Supreme Court ruled even if you win, Republicans, we're still going to use the same lines for November. And they said, well, forget it. We're dropping our opposition to it. So this is the easy one. Nobody is against Prop 40. So if you want an easy one, and by the way,
it's going to fail.
Some of you vote no on everything, but on this one, everybody is for it. So Prop 40 is a yes vote according to everybody.
Even the people who were on the other side.
Right.
And Prop 32, we're going to spend a little more time on it, but we might as well start on it now. This is bringing in tens of millions of dollars on both sides as well. It's called the Paycheck Protection Initiative. It would ban payroll deductions being used for political purposes for unions and for corporations. The question is, how much of a practice is this for unions and for corporations? Mr. Matsusaka?
So this Prop 32 is a huge measure for the state in a variety of different ways. It's actually doing three things, which are material. One, which Pat just mentioned, is it prevents union dues from being used for political purposes. It also prevents unions and corporations from making contributions to candidates. And it also prevents anybody who does business with the state from making contributions to candidates as well. So it's doing three potentially significant things that, if it passed, would have significant effects on the state. The money that's coming in from this is coming in, I think, mostly from Charlie Munger. It's being ferociously opposed by the
$23 million,
unions.
right? Out of a total of something more than
I've got
$45
up to
million.
30, but it's going to keep going. Absolutely, the money against is coming from the unions, the various public employee unions across the state. Because if you prevent them from using union dues, it will certainly undercut their ability to influence elections.
This has been called a game changer or a political earthquake if it passes, because it's going to affect union clout in California.
But isn't it going to affect corporate clout too? Isn't that what it says?
No, well, it says it's going to, but it really doesn't, because we have at the federal level a ban on corporations and labor unions already making campaign contributions. But at the federal level, it's about equal between labor unions and corporations in terms of their clout. This says you can't use payroll deductions to make campaign contributions. It will only affect labor unions and will reduce their influence tremendously in California.
So why does it mention corporations if it only really affects labor
Well, because
unions?
it just says corporations can't use payroll deduction either, but they don't do it. A few do, but very few. The labor union money all comes from payroll deduction.
The latest from maplight.org tracks about $103 million raised on Proposition 32 already, $11 million of it having come in from a group in Arizona called Americans for Responsible Leadership, and we don't know much more about it than that. The Teachers Association, $20 million, the SEIU, about $11 million, lots of money and lots more to talk about Prop 32 and all the propositions on the ballot when we come back with our guests in the Crawford Family Forum with a live audience and streaming live at 89.3 KPCC, Southern California Public Radio. I'm Pat Morrison, presiding over Props and Pints in the Crawford Family Forum. With people who are doing their homework about the November election, with the 10 initiatives and 1 referendum on the California ballot being ably led by Bob Stern, ex of the Center for Governmental Studies, and John Matsusaka of USC. Thank you both for sticking with us through this. Prop 32, the biggest spending of all, more than $100 million, a third of all the money being spent on California ballot committees so far this year, according to maplight.org. And so, Mr. Matsusaka, in talking about who's for it, who's against it, and why.
So, well, I think we've already mentioned a little bit. I think that the opposition to it is very clearly coming from the public employee unions. The people that are for this is a little bit mixed. I think there's a tendency to try to paint, certainly the No campaign is trying to paint the advocates of this as being sort of corporate interests that are trying to get themselves something. But I think it's much more complicated than this. And also, if I can clarify, Bob said something, I don't just to not leave a misimpression, but the federal law does prohibit contributions by corporations to federal candidates, but corporations can still contribute to state candidates. So this law has an actually interesting effect. It says unions and corporations cannot contribute to state candidates, and anybody who does business with the state cannot contribute to those campaigns. So I think, although the No campaign wants to, and I'm not trying to advocate for this, but I do want you to sort of understand that there are some real issues here. I think while the No campaign wants to make this sound like it's a corporate power grab, I think it's much more complicated. It certainly is an attempt to undercut the power of the unions, but it's also an overall attempt, I believe, to take money by big interest groups out of California politics.
And that sounds like a good government issue, which is why that's in the mix as well.
That's right. It is a good government. There's some parts of this that really are good government. The interesting thing to me is that California Common Cause and the California League of Women Voters, both good government groups that support campaign finance measures, are both against this. And they're only against it because of the one provision. I think they like the other provisions, but the one provision, they say, changes the balance of power in California.
Let's get some questions from our audience here in the Crawford Family Forum about Proposition 32. Who are you and what would you like to know? Here we have one right there.
Hello, Jackie McClish from La Habra Heights. I'm curious how the PACs fit into this and whether both the unions and corporations could still contribute to the PACs.
Well, the answer is yes. But the problem is that corporations' money comes from their employees, shareholders, and officers, and they do that at the federal level. That's how they contribute at the federal level. The labor union money comes from the union members, the payroll deduction. And if you eliminate the payroll deduction, the estimate is about 80% of labor union money will dry up.
Another question here in the forum about Proposition 32.
Can I add one clarification onto that too? There's some talk about there being a loophole in this. I don't think there's a loophole in the way it's written, but it's important to understand, when I say there's some talk in the No campaigns, it's important to understand that independent expenditures are going to be allowed regardless of whether this measure passes, because the Supreme Court has said that corporations and unions have a right to make their argument directly. What this does is it stops them contributing to candidate campaigns.
And also they'll be able to contribute to ballot measure campaigns because the Supreme Court has ruled you can't prohibit corporations and labor unions from getting involved in ballot measure campaigns.
So does that just send money underground then?
Not really. I mean, what happens at the federal level is you have these political action committees. In California, the corporation can take the money out of its treasury, out of its profits, and spend it. Under this, they will not be able to do that for candidate campaigns.
I hope you're following along as we move through the ballot pamphlet and you look at what it is you'd like to vote on and how you'd like to vote on it. Proposition 37 is to label genetically engineered food. We're going to take questions from our audience. And of course, we're streaming online at kpcc.org. This is a measure on the face of it that a lot of people would say this looks like a good argument, and yet there's some interesting opposition, including big money from what people would call big ag, but even some people who have some technical interest and a scientific stake in this are saying the usual question, is this a well-written initiative or is it all about good intentions? Where does this look?
So this is a fascinating issue in that respect. On the face of it, it seems like a very good idea. We ought to know what's going on. But interestingly, the American Medical Association has come out opposed to this, and they're not an organization that you think is unfriendly to consumer. The National Academy of Sciences has said that there is no reason to be concerned about genetically modified crops. It's been opposed by essentially every major newspaper in the state, as far as I can tell: LA Times, Sacramento Bee, San Diego, Union Tribune, and so forth. So it's an interesting measure which seems to be trying to cure a problem that doesn't exist in the eyes of many experts.
However, 40 European countries do this. They label their products. And what the proponents are saying is all we want is disclosure. The interesting thing is that 40 to 70% of all the products sold in California grocery stores now contain some genetically engineered ingredients. 88% of corn and 94% of soybeans are grown from genetically engineered seeds. And no one has proven that this is harmful to humans and it enhances crop yield. But the proponents are saying it's just disclosure. All we want is to put it on the label and disclose it. The interesting thing is it started off with a 2/3 to 70% approval vote, and now as you see all these ads on television from these farmers and from these scientists, the yes has come way, way down, and it's very likely it may be defeated because of all the no side, and because, again, when people are confused, they vote no.
And what I'm looking at here is about a 9-to-1 expenditure ratio, with companies like Monsanto and DuPont and Dow AgroSciences outspending the yes on 37 side, which has maybe $4 or $5 million going for it. Is this especially vital because California is such a big agricultural state?
Not only that, if California passes this, it could be like Prop 13. Other states will pass it. And so the manufacturers are very worried that it will spread throughout the country. They're worried about the costs, obviously. There is one newspaper, by the way, that has supported it, and that's the San Francisco Bay Guardian.
Well, and what about the cost? Because the ads are not saying genetically modified food is good or bad. The ads are saying if you pass this, it's going to be burdensome. It's going to be expensive for farmers. It's going to be expensive for food producers to get that kind of information together.
Yes, so certainly one of the concerns with this is that it's going to raise the price of food by requiring labeling. I think a fair amount of the other objection comes, however, from the sense that labeling things is going to create this perception that genetically modified food is somehow dangerous. And I think many of these folks who, the World Health Organization, again, National Academy of Sciences, if you look at the issues which they're concerned about, they believe that having these genetically modified foods, which makes them more nutritious or which makes them able to resist diseases, which we don't have pesticides to do, they feel that it'll drive these foods off the market and ultimately force people into less efficient or less nutritious productive methods. So I think it's the cost issue, but there's also a real concern among some of these folks that what seems like a productive avenue and is helping many parts of the world will be driven out by getting people scared about this.
Bob Stern, it says requires labeling on raw or processed foods offered for sale if they're made from plants or animals with genetic material, prohibits labeling, advertising such food as natural. As you point out, there's some European countries that already require this. Are there parallels and are there examples from Europe that would be instructive to us?
Well, the proponents say it hasn't caused any problems in Europe, and more and more countries are doing this. The ads, of course, are saying that this measure exempts 2/3 of the food consumed by Californians and products such as meat, but not dog food, and alcohol, soy milk, but not cow's milk. So the opponents are trying to throw up all these arguments against it to try to confuse people. But the proponents are saying it works elsewhere. Why can't it work in California?
Mr. Matsusaka, has anybody put a number on the cost, not for the state to administer it, but for companies, for business to comply with it?
I haven't seen anybody yet. I haven't seen that, but maybe they have.
Any questions from the audience about Prop 37? Going once, going twice. All right, let's move along to Prop 33. It changes car insurance rates in California to deal with people who would like your cell phone number. If you want to transfer it from one cell phone company to another, you can do that without a penalty. That's what it would do for people who have auto insurance. But as always with propositions, there's a deeper story to it. So who of our two guests would like to start?
So I will. Prop 33 is a repeat of a measure that was tried before, and it's been slightly tweaked to make it more desirable from the thing that was perceived to take it down last time.
In 2010, voters voted it down.
Voters voted it down, indeed. So as most of you know, auto insurance rates are regulated in the state, and they can only vary based on certain criteria that are specified, like good driver discounts and so forth. One of the criteria is that if you've had coverage from a company for a long period of time, you can have a discount. However, if you switch companies, you don't get that continuity of coverage discount. So what this measure would say is that the auto companies are allowed to give a discount. You can sort of carry your continuity of coverage discount with you. Now, what's the concern with that? Well, the concern with that is that if you allow insurance companies to give discounts to people under those grounds, they're going to have to raise fees somewhere else, which means that people that don't have continuous coverage, that dropped out for one reason or another, will end up paying higher rates.
Or people who are just coming in and starting out to buy car insurance coverage for the first time?
Yes, that would probably, that would be right. Now, the measure from 2 years ago had a feature in it where it looked like if you were a veteran and you went on military, if you were in the military service and you were gone for a little while, or you were unemployed and you couldn't afford your coverage, that you would then get put into the pool of non-continuous coverage and have to pay a higher rate. This measure comes back and provides exceptions for those particular cases, which is why I think the proponents think they have a better chance this time with getting it through.
Most of the funding for this comes from a man who I think is the owner of Mercury Insurance, which
That's right. George Joseph is 91 years old. This is his legacy proposition.
And he's spending about $9 million on this.
I was fascinated. Every major newspaper is against it. I was surprised by that. Most consumer organizations are against it. Consumers Union, Consumer Federation of America, and Consumer Watchdog, which is located in Santa Monica, that sponsored the famous Prop 103 in 1988 that lowered the auto insurance.
Why is that group against this?
Because they're tinkering with Prop 103. And that was sacred for them, and they don't like the idea of changing 103. Also, they're very concerned about low-income people coming into the market for the first time, having to pay higher insurance rates because of this. There is one consumer organization that is for it. The Green Lining Institute, a very liberal consumer organization out of Berkeley, is for it. So it's not unanimous on this. The polls are showing that this is ahead somewhat. We spend $25 billion a year on auto insurance just in California.
And all of those people who are hitting me have no insurance, so I don't know where that $25 billion is going. Mr. Matsuzaka?
Yeah, nothing to add to that.
And we keep fiddling on car insurance things because it is such a big part of our lives, I suppose.
Well, that's right. And Prop 103 was this David versus Goliath proposition in 1988. All the insurance companies opposed it. It passed. It lowered our insurance by 20%. And Harvey Rosenfield, who is the proponent of that, is very upset with Mercury Insurance coming in, tinkering with his proposal.
We have another measure, Proposition 39, increasing taxes on out-of-state businesses. Of course, we hear a lot about now with Amazon and companies that may not have a footprint in California being taxed at California rates. Gentlemen, which of you would like to take this and tell us what it would do?
Well, this is probably one of the most complicated ones, although the nice thing about this is you're not seeing very many ads against it. You're only seeing ads for it. Again, a hedge fund manager, Tom Steyer, is the one who put up the money for this.
$22 million.
That's right. He's put up a lot of money. And this deals with multi-state corporations, they calculate their taxes. And the legislature a few years ago passed a last-minute bill that allowed corporations that have employees and businesses out of the state to use a different calculation. So it's costing the state $1 billion because of the calculation they're using. The fascinating thing to me is that the corporations are not opposing this.
So we're just correcting the legislature's math?
You could say that, yeah.
Mr. Matsuzaka?
Well, there's one other piece of this. I think if it were just changing the tax code and getting $1 billion in, it would be almost a no-brainer. But the other interesting wrinkle in this is that of that $1 billion, $550 million is dedicated per year to a clean energy projects, which is actually what the sponsor is business is as well. So I think that's going to give some people.
Oh, that's the cui bono part here. Huh?
Yeah, so I think that's going to give some people some pause because there's a real question in a time when we're desperate for cash. We could all use $1 billion to send it into education. Do we want to send half a billion of that to clean energy projects? And that's in some sense, I think, what brought down the tobacco tax measure earlier this year. Not that people were opposed to the tax, but to dedicating the funds to a specific cause.
Of course, it can be argued if this goes down, there is no money for anything, including schools. And again, I'm surprised. Most of the major newspapers are for it. The few exceptions, like the San Diego Union, San Francisco Chronicle, Labor's for it. The Chamber of Commerce is against it. But I am so surprised there are no ads being run against it.
We're just asking you. I haven't seen anything on television.
Well, there's ads for it. He's been running ads for it. But this is
I must have changed the channel.
well, this is $1 billion we're talking about a year, and for no ads to be run against it is remarkable to me.
The money I saw so far, General Motors gave $20,000 against it, which is essentially the change you find in the car seats when they come off the assembly line.
Maybe your car seat,
And,
not
and,
mine.
and Kimberly Clark, the paper towel people, 20,000. So there doesn't seem to be a lot of heart in the opposition to Proposition
And the
39.
latest poll shows it about 61% yes. So this one, I think, may pass, but you never know with these last-minute things, and you never know how many people are going to vote no on everything.
Gentlemen, real quickly, what kind of turnout do you think we're going to get? It's a presidential election year. That always tends to drive it. Does that help on propositions, or does it? Do people tend to drop off as they get farther down the ballot?
Well, it's presidential election year. There's a lot of interest in that, so that drives turnout, of course. On the other hand, California is there's not a lot of suspense. So who's going to take California's electoral votes? So I don't think that's so much. But there are some really pretty important propositions on the ballot this time. So I certainly hope that will get people to the polls.
And the legislature, by the way, monkeyed around with our system to say initiatives had to be on the November ballot, and they did that because of Prop 32. Because they wanted more people to turn out on, this is the union measure, if you remember, the contributions by unions. So they made sure that Prop 32 was on the November ballot. Ironically, that affects Prop 30.
We've really marched through the ballot for the November election here in California in the Crawford Family Forum, and I want to thank everybody here. We're going to continue live streaming for about a half an hour with more questions from our audience about some other measures you may not have heard of. So thanks, of course, to Bob Stern and to John Matsusaka for joining us. Props and Pints at the Crawford Family Forum was produced by Janice Wachi-Hurst and Raghu Manavalan. Our engineer is Steve Martine. Thanks to interns Haley Waters and Jack McHenry, Jason George and the KPCC digital team, and the Crawford Family Forum for hosting. Heirloom LA, I know you'll cheer this, provided the food. Eagle Rock Brewery, the beverages. And we're going to hear a little more of the Proposition song, courtesy of the California Voter Foundation. You can also check out the new Pat Morrison blog site, kpcc.org/Pat. Information on everything going on now with us here at 89.3 KPCC. Have a listen and follow along. Our live streaming content, and you can go back over the ground that we have covered, or maybe there's some new territory in some of the props. There's also one proposition that we didn't get to, which is Prop 31, the 2-year budget cycle, which is something that some people in the legislature and even people in Congress have been talking about for a while. So before we get to your questions, maybe we can deal with the 2-year budget cycle.
So the headline on that measure is the 2-year budget cycle, and it does say that the legislature does 2-year budgeting like it sounds. It is what it is. But there's a bunch of other things which are in that measure which I think are interesting. The one I think is most interesting is that it gives the governor the ability in a fiscal emergency, meaning a situation where the state goes into a deficit, to actually cut spending. And that would actually have very far-reaching ramifications, because right now the state is required to have a balanced budget, but if the state goes into deficit, the governor can call an emergency and call the legislature back, but the Constitution doesn't say what happens if they don't agree. So it could just go on forever. And so this would actually close that hole.
And they already have in regular session, right?
And they just go on, and then nobody knows what the end game is, so it's very confusing. But this would actually say the governor has the authority to make the cuts, which could be good or could be bad, but I think would actually have a potentially significant ramification, because people would look down the path and understand where it's going to go when they're bargaining.
There are two other provisions that are very important. One I actually suggested to the group and they accepted. and that was that no bill be passed by the legislature unless it's in print 3 days. Right now, they pass these last-minute bills that nobody reads, and I said, look, these bills should be in print so that everybody has a chance to read them, and they put that in the proposition. That's fairly non-controversial, although George Skelton, the LA Times, said he likes the last-minute deals sometimes.
Oh, it's much better copy, but don't they do these zombie bills where they'll create a shell number for a piece of
Yeah,
legislation
and then the last
and then
day-
just stuff it with
Right,
whatever
exactly. Now, the
content
other
they
part
want?
is very controversial, and that is it sets rules for any measure or bill that costs 25 million or more has to be offset by cutting other programs or raising taxes or both. That's why the labor unions are against this, because they're very concerned about this particular provision. This one is probably the most complicated one. It's sponsored by California Forward. Our organization actually helped set up California Forward, but we're not involved with this other than my suggestions. Almost all the newspapers are for it, except for the Sacramento Bee and the San Francisco Bay Guardian are both against it. And fascinating, LA Times has not taken a position on it yet. The League of Women Voters, Labor, and Sierra Club are against it. The Chamber of Commerce is for it. The latest polls show it. Not many people understand it, know about it, so it's about 38-36. So there's some question whether it will pass or not. There's been no advertising one way or the other. Watch your slate cards and see if they buy onto it. Fascinating, a multi-billionaire, Nicholas Berguin, was supposed to be sponsoring this and putting lots of money in it. He's backed off because the Sierra Club has come out against it.
Yeah, he's the one who's sponsoring the Long Now committee, the
Think
Think Now
Now,
committee,
yeah.
right, which is
Think
about
Long,
trying to
Think Now,
think
yeah.
California out of its problems,
Right.
but he's pulled away.
He's pulled out. Yeah.
So, let's get some questions perhaps about this before we deal with some other ballot measures and about any of the ballot measures we've been talking about here. If questions were raised in your minds as you've been hearing us talk, let's have a question here. Who you are, and where you are from. Oh, right over here. Can you wait till we get a microphone to you, please? And we're going to hold on to the microphone ourselves.
I'm Karen. I'm from South Pasadena. I just wonder how this compares to other states with the same sort of issues or ballot type of.
You mean the 2-year budgeting
Yes.
cycle?
Yes, several states have a 2-year budgeting cycle, and many people think it's a better way to go. The problem, of course, is that California changes its budget all the time, and depends on, as John indicates, the income coming in. So we're always tinkering with the budget. But a lot of people feel it's better for the legislature to have hearings only once every couple of years and then tinker with it as things change.
And
Yeah.
we have I'm sorry, Mr. Matsusaka?
No, I was going to say that I think a 2-year budgeting is a better way to do it, all else equal, but I actually think the more important parts of it are buried down in the guts of it, the requirement that new bills balance or pay for themselves, and giving the governor the authority to cut spending in
Who
emergency.
sponsored this again?
California Forward sponsored this, and they were funded by 5 foundations and are sort of part of the Think Long operation.
Another question back here. Who are you? Where are you from? We're going to hold on to the mic for you. Thank you.
Hi, Susan Albrecht from Chino Hills. So I had a question on Proposition 34, ending the death penalty. You had mentioned that ending the death penalty actually saves money, where I would have thought that the death penalty saves money because you don't have to have people in prison forever, but actually it's the other way around.
Let's explain how that works. And that's a very common concept too.
Yeah, you'd be right if we executed the prisoners. But we don't execute the prisoners. They're on death row forever. Only a handful since 1978 have been executed.
And there's also mandated appeal processes to a death penalty because of constitutional considerations. You have to go through X, Y, and Z before you can execute someone. And that has added somewhat to the cost.
I mean, the fascinating part has been that those who've been exonerated, about 150 people have been exonerated across the country, and their average time for exoneration was 14 years. It took them 14 years to be exonerated. And clearly, I mean, they were found innocent and not guilty. Nobody in California has been in that position that we know of yet.
Mr. Matsusaka? No. So that's where a lot of the savings comes from, is the fact that I think our number was California had executed 13 people in the course of 35 years since the death penalty was reinstituted. So another question about any of the propositions, any of the measures we've talked about. There are a couple of questions up here toward the front, and we've got one right here. Can you tell us who you are and where you're from, please?
Mika Kramer, South Pasadena. My question is about Proposition 39. The provision, would that likely result in companies charging sales tax to California residents, meaning that it might likely then help businesses in California because they're not competing against other businesses who do not charge sales tax?
We're scratching our heads up here.
Yeah, I mean, sales tax, if you sell in California, you got to pay California sales tax. That's given. So, I mean, one of the questions might be, will this cause some of these companies not to want to do business in California? That's certainly a possibility, or do a little bit less business. That's presumably why this was done in the first place, is to try to give these businesses some incentive to come into the state. So that's a possibility.
Actually, what's happened is it's encouraged businesses to leave the state because they get a tax benefit if they're located out of the state and their employees are out of the state. And the argument of the proponents is actually more businesses will come in the state because they won't have the incentive to leave the state. The sales tax, as long as you're selling in California, no matter where you're located, under the new rules, you have to charge sales tax.
Is this a break that bigger companies with multi-state operations have gotten over mom and pop businesses?
That's right. They pushed this through in the last day of the legislature a few years ago, and the legislature now is regretting it.
Another question here.
Yes.
Who are you and where are you
yes,
from?
Carol Rubenstein Mendel from Westwood. On Proposition 30, I'm not sure I heard this correctly, that 89% of the funds would go for K through 12, 11% to junior college, but that's on 40% of the money. Is that correct? That the rest is going to light rail or the environment, or I wasn't clear about that.
Yeah, it's a good question. So the money that's raised from the tax goes into a dedicated fund. Of that fund, 89% goes to K through 12 and 11% goes to community colleges. The question is, there's nothing in there that prevents the legislature from saying, okay, you've got another $6 billion going into education. Now I'm going to cut my education allocations from the general fund. Okay,
and spend it on other things.
And spend it on whatever other needs we have in the state. So that's the trick here. Now we think, for at least for the first year, because of the way they set up the budget and the triggers, that it'll probably, most of it will go to education. But after the first year, it's not at all clear. There's nothing that guarantees it. The only thing that we know pretty confidently, because of Prop 98, is that when more money comes in, at least 40% of it, roughly speaking, has to go to education. So if you ask me to just guess, my guess is about 40% at least will go there, but part of it's going to be used for
It'll start
other
up
things.
higher and then maybe go down to your estimation?
The first year, I think it will all go to education, because if this doesn't pass, the legislature says it has a bill already passed that cuts education by $6 billion. So I think John's right. The first year, it will pretty much all go to education. After that, we don't know, but at least 40% will go. And my guess is, because of the clout, unless Prop 32 passes, because of the clout of the California Teachers Association, and with Jerry Brown there, most of it will go to education, because that's what they told the public it would do. And they're not going to go back, I think, on this one, because the public wants the money to go to education.
And
so I guess it's very hard to guess. I think the public wants the money to go to education. The public doesn't want the money to go to high-speed rail, but it's going there too. So I think it's less obvious that, at least if you ask me, I'm not sure what's going to happen. But my observation, the way money seems to get spent, a lot goes to education, but some things go to other programs too that people don't like as much. I don't see any reason this money would be all that different. But
don't you want to take the train to San Francisco for dinner?
Absolutely.
Some do.
Absolutely. The high-speed rail will be something like the water project was several years ago. It will put California ahead of the rest of the country.
Which that would be something for a change. We have another question here. Who are you? Where are you from?
Alex Fargo. I'm from Altadena. On a number of these propositions, you keep saying, well, we don't know whether it's well written. How in the world is anybody supposed to figure that out?
That's the big question that underlies a lot of these, that the intention may be good, but how well they deliver. The law of unintended consequences seems to be what we pass every time.
So even the best written thing, we don't actually know what's going to happen. So there's always a certain amount of that. I think I think a regular voter can't spend time reading through the actual detailed language. In fact, when I see no campaign say, go read the actual language. To me, that just tells me that they're bluffing, because they know nobody's going to read the actual language. They're just trying to scare you when they say that. But I think what people ought to do is find people that you trust who are experts. And again, I like to use the example of environmental groups. If you happen to be a supporter of the Sierra Club, I mean, they'll have their experts look at environmental measures and tell you whether it should be trusted or not. And if you don't, you know, for other issues, you can find the group or the individuals that you trust. But I think that's actually a very sound way to go, is to rely on expert opinions for some understanding of these measures.
Having been involved with initiative campaigns, I can tell you these initiatives are as well written as legislation. Now, not necessarily, you know, not necessarily great. I mean, nothing is perfect. I wrote the Political Reform Act several years ago. It was an 18,000-word proposition that 70% of Californians passed. I knew at the time it wouldn't be perfect, and I let the legislature amend it. I mean, you can't write a perfect measure, but you can make it better. And some of these make it better, and some of these don't.
A lot of states do have an initiative process, but they also have some protections built into them. And one of the suggestions in California is that they all sunset after 10 years so that they expire and you get a chance to revisit them. For example, people have criticized Prop 13 because there's a disequilibrium now between the burden that commercial properties pay in taxes because they don't change hands so much versus residential properties. So
can you imagine if we sunsetted how many more propositions would be on the ballot?
Like I said, take a sleeping bag. Let's give away another one of our goodie bags right now, and I want you to raise your hand if you know the answer to the question of what property tax measure in 1978 was on the ballot competing with Prop 13. Do you know the number of that one? Anybody? No. Anybody know the answer? Let's have a question. Let's back here. Do you know the answer? Proposition. Let's get a microphone to this man.
Proposition 8.
Proposition 8. Yay. This is sort of the last minute thing that Jerry Brown and the legislature put on when they saw Prop 13 was heading their way, right?
That's right. And it went down flamingly.
And it would have only been about residential property, not commercial property.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Yes.
very good. How did you happen to know that? Oh, I did? Well, I get the bag then. Give that over here.
And also, that's my son.
Let's have more questions from the audience about the propositions we've been discussing here. Who are you? Where are you from?
I'm Brent Walmsley. I'm from Long Beach. With what was it, Prop 98, that said that 39% of the budget had to go towards education. But that is void if there's something called a fiscal emergency, right? So we've had that since 2003. So we've been in a state of emergency for 9 years. It's a long emergency.
That's like the yellow alert at the airports.
Yeah. So I mean, it leaves me curious a little bit. I mean, like when you talk about any of these education measures, I mean, how can that change so that we're not in a state of emergency, so that education is getting the 39% that it needs?
Well, I mean, Prop 98 is a complicated thing, and I think there's an industry of people just trying to understand exactly what it means with 3 tests and so forth. My understanding is that if there's an emergency and you suspend it, you still have to pay it back eventually. So I don't think the legislature can totally get out of it, if I understand correctly.
And the reason we've been in emergency is the fact that our revenues have not matched our expenditures, and we've cut education by $20 billion since 2008. Everybody was assuming the economy would come back. It just hasn't come back. But we still spend an awful lot of money on education. In fact, sometimes it's actually higher than 39%. Sometimes it's 40 and 41%. But education has suffered just like everything else in the state with the lack of revenues coming in.
And in some ways, Proposition 98, which was meant to be a floor for education funding, has turned into a ceiling in some ways, too, which is why these measures like Molly Munger's have come to the fore. Some other questions out there as you go through your ballot? Over here, can you stand up and tell us who you are and where you're from?
Hi, I'm Lynn from Baldwin Vista, and my question is going back to Prop 38 and the debt reduction component of that prop. I'm wondering if you can speak to whether or not, well, first of all, why marry more funding for education with debt reduction? Why was that kind of married together? And then also, is it a drop in the bucket, or is it really something that can do the deed?
Think about $10 billion size drop, right?
Yeah, I don't know why she put that in there. But it does, she says it will take care of the debt within 5 years. And it's about a third of the proposition goes to reduction of debt for 5 years. And then after that, it all goes to education. I just don't know why she put it in there. Maybe she felt it polled well.
Mr. Matsusaki, you have a clue?
I don't know the answer to that either. It's
I wonder whether it has anything to do with a bond standing in our credit rating. No? So, another question over here. We've stumped the experts. Let's see. Can you stand up, tell us who you are and where you're
Hi.
from?
Lori Beckland, Hollywood.
I also was asking about Prop 38 and 30. One of the things that I notice about 38, if I understand this right, is that there's actually a kind of school reform element to it because it requires funds to go directly to the individual schools to a degree, bypassing districts like LAUSD. And I don't know is there a similar element at all in Prop 30, and how do you two see that?
I don't think there is a similar element. 38, the legislature can't touch the money, and it does go to school districts, whereas 30, I think after the first year, John is right, the legislature could potentially touch the money, but most of it will go to schools, I think.
Yeah, I'm not aware of something similar in Prop 30. I mean, to me, it's very clear that 38 sequesters the money very much clearly and gets it to schools. Again, for better or worse. But if that's what you want to do, I think that one's much better doing that.
What is the genesis of the requirement that both can't pass? That you can't have 30 and 38 pass, even if they both get more than 50% of the vote?
There's a constitutional provision that talks about this, and the Supreme Court has said we don't want to mess around with two propositions that deal with the same subject. We don't want to mesh them together. I actually was co-authored a measure in 1988 dealing with campaign finance reform that passed, got 53% of the vote. Another measure got 57% of the vote, and we argued that ours should go into effect as long as it didn't conflict with the others. And the Supreme Court, by a vote of 4-3, said no. Only one measure goes into effect. We don't want to deal with two measures. Whichever gets the most votes goes into effect. In a sense, they were, in my mind, a little lazy about it, but in their mind, they said, look, we want to make it very simple. Whoever gets the most votes, that's the one that goes into effect entirely, and forget the other one, even though you got 53% of the vote.
It's my understanding that at least one of these measures also explicitly wrote into it that if it passes, if it passes with more votes, it takes the other one completely out of existence.
A poison pill.
So to not allow any sort of meshing is my understanding.
Wow. Another question back here?
Kevin Albrecht from Chino Hills. With regards to 32 and 38 as well, I was wondering what's the tangible difference if neither passes? I'm of the mindset that neither should go through. What is the real difference if they don't?
30 and 38, and I think
38.
we're talking about the triggers that Proposition 30 has.
If Prop 30 goes down, or 38 gets more votes, there is a trigger bill that's passed the legislature that says we're going to cut the school funding by $6 billion. They're talking about 3 weeks less of schools. Whether that will actually happen, we're not sure. But unless the legislature passes something and the governor signs it, it's sort of like the federal sequester. That's going to go into effect unless Congress passes something. There may be enough of an outcry that will take care of it. But clearly, there's no question that school funding will go down by a certain amount of money if 30 doesn't pass, or 30 and 38 don't pass.
Yes, so the governor and the legislature did something which is somewhat interesting and different in this one, is they really set up this trigger when they actually wrote the budget bills here, which said that if it doesn't pass, these specific things happen. So they made it very, very clear what would happen. So I think we know that if 30 doesn't pass, there isn't going to be $6 billion more. What exactly happens, I think, is if they don't go back around and change their minds, which they certainly have the right to do, and they may well do, then we're going to get stuck with that, or at least over the first year. Now, it's interesting. I've seen some interesting discussions recently by people suggesting, well, maybe that's not a bad thing because this is a patch, and what we really need is a serious rethinking of our entire budgetary situation. And giving the legislature this money is just going to allow them to continue, barely scraping by. And that some people have argued maybe the better thing is to say no to them and make them go back and do it right at this point and get the guts to raise taxes properly if that's what they want to do, or cut spending if that's what they want to do. So I think it's interesting what would happen. I think that the simplest thing is probably what they said they're going to do in the first year would happen, and you have $6 billion less dollars.
I mean, the problem, of course, is to raise taxes at the legislature takes a 2/3 vote. And we know that 2/3 of Californians are not in favor of raising taxes. The real question is 51% in favor of raising taxes?
Was there another question back here?
Hi, Pat. This is Rich McClish. I'm from La Habra Heights. Regarding the budget, the money that's allocated to the schools, how many billions are you talking about? So you brought up $6 billion. I don't know what percentage is that.
Oh, what percentage of the
total
K through 12?
Yeah, how many billions are actually allocated to the schools here in California?
What is the K through 12 budget? Anybody else?
I think it's around $50 billion.
So it's a,
I
we're
think
talking
I'm
about
done.
10 or
That sounds about right. I mean,
15%.
they're getting at least 40% of the general fund,
Right.
which is getting them about 45, and then more than that. So that sounds about right, 50-ish.
And apparently, over the last several years, it's been cut several $1 billion.
Another question? In the back and then a little more to the front here.
Mika Kramer, South Pasadena. Also on the 38, I just want to clarify. So sales taxes and personal taxes would go up drastically with 38, but a lot less with 30. Which one is it now, the 30 and the 32?
We're talking about the tax increases in
If-
one.
if-
One
if
of them is sales tax and income tax, that's Prop 30. The other one is just income tax.
If you
correct?
make more than $250,000 a year, single person, or more than $500,000 a married couple, your income tax will go up
Under Prop 30.
Up under Prop 30. It'll also go up with Prop 38. All of you will be paying more sales tax, 0.25%. Again, it's about $75 if you spend a $30,000 car.
Prop 30.
Prop 30. Under Prop 38, almost everybody's income tax goes up by a small amount if you don't make much money, a much larger amount, although actually less than Jerry Brown's for the millionaires. But it will go up substantially if you're a millionaire under either proposition.
Another question right here.
Matthew Atha, Pasadena. Our panelists have made it extremely clear that it is very expensive to get a proposition put on the ballot. Can you explain a little bit what that process is like and what is required in order to get a proposition on the ballot?
If you have $3 million, I can guarantee you get on the ballot. It takes about $2 to $3 million to get on the ballot, and that's all it takes is that money. If you don't have $1 million, forget it. You're not going to get on the ballot. But just because
Now, that money goes to signatures.
I have suggested, somewhat facetiously, just pay the state $2 million.
Good idea.
You know?
Yeah. No,
I
I
mean,
think it's a great
candidates
idea.
pay to get on the ballot. Why not just pay the state the $2 million to help our budget deficit? You will get on the ballot anyway. The way we qualify measures is absolutely stupid in my mind. There has to be a better way of qualifying measures.
It has to be a percentage of people who voted in the last
5% or 8%.
election.
Right. Once you get on the ballot, though, only a third of you will pass your measure. Just because you're on the ballot doesn't mean it's going to pass. It does cause us to have to discuss it, however.
There are no measures that get on the ballot because ordinary citizens fan out across their neighborhoods and collect signatures in their spare time. That doesn't happen. It's all, you have to hire a signature petition firm and pay $1 to $3 million depending on how much of a hurry you're in, and that's what happens. I think Bob's idea is actually a perfectly good one. It's clockwork. If you pay the money, you will get on the ballot. I don't know why you don't just write the check to the state and we could use the money for education or something.
In fact, the whole thing has sort of been inverted from its purpose of 100 years ago. And I think the headline in the New York Times was a measure that began as a populist measure is now being owned by billionaires.
The other way to do it is by internet, is to say, okay, you can sign something on the internet. I would require you to answer 3 questions about the proposition. And I would also let people say they don't want it on the ballot. So you'd have a campaign against it on the ballot. But that would be a cheaper way of doing it.
Somebody else? We have another question back here. Can you tell us who you are and where you're from?
Hi, my name is Alexis Newell. I'm from Pasadena. I'm just curious, you're saying that Prop 32 will disable unions from spending money on political campaigns, especially unions that are taking straight out of paychecks. I'm just curious if you think that it will affect their political weight through endorsement, per se.
No, I mean, certainly the ability to make endorsements will still be there, but it will affect their political weights. If they can't contribute to candidate campaigns, it'll have a huge effect. I think that's one of the real questions for the voters in this election. Are they comfortable right now? Because if you take this group away, they've been very influential in the state for perhaps for good, perhaps for bad, but I think that's the question that's really before the voters right now.
And for school board elections and some city elections, it has a big impact because the unions are the only ones who make contributions in those races.
And because many of those races are not partisan races. And you
Well, they're
don't
all
have the
nonpartisan
same-
races, that's right. But the unions really care about school board candidates because then they get to negotiate with the people they elect. So it really has a big impact there. At the state level, it has a big impact as well because business and labor right now spend about the same amount of money. Although in my mind, labor has a bigger impact on the state legislature because they're Democrats. Somebody called the California Teachers Association the fourth branch of government. They get to veto almost anything at the state level.
Let's give away another gift bag in that wonderful fluorescent orange that you will not lose in your car, although in my car it's entirely possible. So the question is, Jerry Brown sponsoring Prop 30 this year. When he first ran for governor in 1974, what proposition did he sponsor? This was back when he was the youngest governor in the history of California. Now we have him as the oldest. So anybody know what proposition he sponsored? I didn't give this one away, I don't think. No? All right, we'll move on to something else, and we'll find another question. But the answer to that, Bob Stern?
It was the
Because
Political
he helped
Reform
him do
Act, Proposition 9, which I helped draft for Jerry Brown in 1974.
And 18,000 words? Did he read it?
He read every single word, and he commented on the commas, and he gave me input on it. I mean, and it passed by 70% of the vote. So that was, unfortunately, at age 30, that was the high point of my career.
All right, let's try again with our gift bag. How many states have the initiative process? There are enough of you to guess serially, one after the other, and somebody's going to get it right. Let's get a couple hands back here, right there.
21?
Nope. Nope.
15?
Nope. Nope.
23?
Nope. 4, no.
6.
Over here? No.
32.
This sounds like bingo. All right, we may have to get an answer up front here.
24.
24. Somebody was just one number off. All right. Anybody know the first state to adopt the initiative process? No. We were not first in that either. No? What? No, not New York.
Doesn't have it. Doesn't have it.
What?
Oregon has it.
Only 28 states to go. We'll come up with another
It's
one.
an obscure one. It's very obscure, and it's known for Mount Rushmore.
Hey! Hey, you know where Mount Rushmore is, too. I want to ask both of you before we go. There's this question about a chicken and egg question, whether the initiatives are on the ballot and the numbers they are and dealing with the issues they are because the legislature isn't acting, or are the initiatives crowding the legislature out of the process and becoming a fourth branch of government?
Well, the initiatives have been a huge part of the state's governance for 100 years now, so I don't think it's becoming. They've been huge, but there aren't that. At the same time, there aren't really that many that actually get passed. If you count it up, it's a fairly small number compared to the thousands and thousands of bills that the legislature passes every day. So I think the initiatives are this big thing that looms in and every once in a while drops in with a big rule like Prop 13 or 98 or something, and then otherwise just kind of fizzles away at the edges.
With the exception maybe of the genetically modified measure and maybe the sexual trafficking measure, almost every initiative goes to the legislature first. And if the legislature passes it, the initiative won't pass. So generally, initiatives only are put on the ballot when the legislature refuses to act. Term limits, redistricting reform, campaign reform, drug rehabilitation, death penalty, Prop 13, property taxes, all these went to the legislature first, and the legislature said, forget it, we're not passing it. And some of these passed by big amounts, others did not. The other problem, of course, is many of these have to pass the legislature by a 2/3 vote. You only have to pass the citizens by a majority vote. And that's the big problem in my mind, is the 2/3 vote, stopping many of these things from passing the legislature.
Do we have anybody in here who's voting for the first time? This is your first election? You know what? Let's give her the gift bag. How about it? I want to thank all of you for taking the initiative to be here and for bringing in your ballots, doing your homework, and to thank our guests, John Matsusaka and Bob Stern. I'm Pat Morrison. It's 89.3 KPCC. That was great.
Oh, we're having an election November 6th a day, 11 propositions.